Demoted at your age? That's a ground for divorce.
What? I tried to clear up Susan's misunderstanding with a carefully chosen response, but she cut me off every time, screaming.
I'll prepare the divorce papers and leave the house by tomorrow. I'm leaving all the hassle to you. You've been so naggy lately, and I've been wondering when to divorce you. This is just perfect.
Until that moment, I might have still had illusions about Susan. However, that day, those illusions were completely shattered. The word divorce kept echoing in my head. Before I knew it, I had agreed. Why hadn't I thought of divorce before? A broken relationship doesn't easily mend, and a twisted personality never returns to what it was. I'll get in touch about what comes next. With a transfer and a divorce looming, I had a lot on my plate. I am James Harrison, 59 years old. I work as a businessman in a major company. I married Susan when I was 39, and this year marks our 20th anniversary. Considering the era, both Susan at 29 and I at 39 married quite late. But I had my reasons. In fact, in my 20s, I nearly married another woman I was dating. However, due to her infidelity, that relationship ended disastrously. Betrayed, I was deeply hurt at the time. So for over a decade, I had no intention of marrying anyone. I decided I would never get involved with women again and just live alone. Then one day, I met Susan. She was a mysterious beauty with a shadowy charm, new to my favorite coffee shop. I used to enjoy talking with the barista while drinking coffee, but Susan was a newcomer. She sat by the window, staring pensively at her coffee. I couldn't just ignore her. So, meddling as it may have seemed, I started talking to her with the barista's help. At first, Susan was wary of us older men. But after a few conversations, she gradually opened up and shared her circumstances. Apparently, her last company didn't work out, and she was job hunting. But the timing was awful. The economic climate was such that even recent graduates were struggling to find jobs, making it difficult for her to secure her next position. I felt sorry for her, and every time we met, I listened to her concerns. Initially, our interactions were just once a week at the coffee shop, chatting for about an hour. However, before I knew it, our meetings had extended beyond the coffee shop, and we were dating in various places. Time with Susan made my traumas fade away as if they never existed. She was a wonderful person, and I was increasingly drawn to her. Then I made a decision. I remember it vividly. Our date that day ended with dinner at a fancy restaurant. But I had decided to confess right after, which made me incredibly nervous. So, I drank too much, and before I knew it, I was drunk. Looking back, my confession was truly awful. If you haven't found a job yet, how about working with me? Even considering I was under the influence of alcohol, I still think it was quite a line, counting from the bottom up. But despite my clumsy attempt, Susan laughed.
If I'm good enough for you, I'd be delighted.
Then, with tears in her eyes, she took my hand. That day was truly the best day of my life. By the way, we don't have children. The reason is Susan's infertility. I only learned about this when we were finally about to file our marriage certificate.
I have something I must tell you.
Susan said that tremblingly, and I was taken aback.
I can't have children. I'm sorry for keeping it quiet until now. An ex called me damaged goods, and it traumatized me. I really like you, James, and I couldn't bear being told such things again.
I held her gently as she spoke through her tears. Thank you for sharing something so painful, but it's okay. We don't need kids to have a good life together. We're becoming a couple. Let's support each other and live our lives together. Those were my true feelings. Even now, 20 years into our marriage, my feelings haven't changed. However, no matter how much you love each other, spouses are still strangers. Maybe children are the only thing that can truly bond a marriage. About 10 years into our marriage, Susan began acting strangely.
I'll be away from home for about 2 weeks.
That's quite a long time. Weren't you just traveling to Dubai or somewhere last week?
Ah, last week was Singapore. Dubai was before that.
Was it? She started not coming home. At first, it was just going out for drinks with friends or taking a trip to a theme park. But before I knew it, it turned into day trips and then overnight stays. Now, she often goes on trips abroad, assuming multiple overnight stays. Recently, haven't you been playing a bit too much? You hardly do any housework, and we're seeing less and less of each other.
Do you think? We're having a conversation right now, aren't we? Oh, try this stew. It's delicious.
She offered me a pre-prepared stew. It was indeed tasty, but I sighed. Glancing over, I saw a luxury bag on the sofa. Susan had bought it suddenly last month.
I found something that matched the accessory I bought yesterday.
My earnings aren't low compared to my peers. So, Susan asking for presents on anniversaries or wanting a fancy dinner didn't put us in hardship. Still, her recent extravagant spending was too much. I don't want to nag, but your recent behavior is excessive, and I can't keep working forever, you know.
So what? You're not thinking about early retirement, are you?
I wouldn't do that. I love my job, but consider my age.
If you're still working, then it shouldn't be a problem, right? If you have time to talk about useless things, maybe you should spend some private time improving yourself, even though I'm not sure it's meaningful at your age.
My desperate appeal didn't reach Susan. Day by day, I could only send her off on her travels, swallowing my sighs. I kept hoping she'd curb her spending, even just a little. Before I knew it, the number of times Susan and I met had decreased so much that I wasn't sure if we could still be called a couple. Just the other day, we had dinner together, but before that, I hadn't seen Susan's face for 3 weeks. And before that, it had been another 2 weeks. Seeing each other once a week felt like a lot, given how little time we spent together. But it wasn't just because Susan frequently traveled, there was another reason. On weekdays, I made sure to come home as late as possible. Of course, that was also Susan's wish. I had been working in a department known for its long hours, even before we got married. I had told Susan about this during our dating days, and she had accepted it with a sentiment of, "It's lonely, but it can't be helped." However, after we got married, my department colleagues were considerate. For a while, they arranged things so I could come home early. But when I did come home early, Susan was furious.
Huh, it's still the afternoon. Why are you home at this hour?
Why? Because I got off work on time today. How about we go out for dinner since I'm home early?
Unbelievable. I don't care about that. Don't slack off. Go back to work. Hurry up and get promoted and make more money.
She wouldn't listen to a word I said and just kept yelling at me. I could smell alcohol on Susan's breath and see that she was drunk. The fact that she was drinking at this hour was a bit off-putting. But more shocking than that was her fierce demeanor. I'm not slacking off. It's just that everyone's being considerate because we're newlyweds. We can't waste their kindness.
What? That's totally unnecessary. You should have refused it. It's more important for you to work overtime and earn money than to come home and bother me.
Even for a drunk, Susan's words were harsh. At that time, I was newly married and loved her. That's why I didn't want to see Susan like this. All right, I understand. From the next day, I started working late as much as possible, following her words. Occasionally, if I finished work on time, I would often go out for drinks with colleagues to delay coming home. I was scared to face Susan. I still wanted to be married to her. Our marriage slowly disintegrated over time. To an outsider, it must have seemed puzzling why we kept our marriage going because it had become so cold. But because it took a long time to fall apart, my senses were numbed. I vaguely thought that continuing this marital life was natural. However, such an unstable relationship could not last forever. A transfer, you say? One day, I received an order to move to a rural branch. This order was expected. There had been discussions about it before. However, I hadn't told Susan about this. Not that I was hiding it, but simply because we hadn't had the chance to talk.
Demoted at your age? That's a ground for divorce.
What? I tried to explain the situation to Susan as matter-of-factly as possible. I was sure she would do something outrageous in response to my words. But before I could explain everything, Susan erupted in anger. No,
Excuses are enough. You're an elite and wealthy. That's why I married you. Why else would I marry a man 10 years older?
Susan,
Don't even say my name. It makes me sick.
I tried to clear up Susan's misunderstanding with carefully chosen words. However, she cut me off every time, screaming,
I'll prepare the divorce papers and leave the house by tomorrow. I'm leaving all the hassle to you. You've been so naggy lately, and I've been wondering when to divorce you. This is just perfect.
Until that moment, I might have still had illusions about Susan. The illusion of the charming woman I met in the coffee shop 20 years ago. However, that day, those illusions were completely shattered. The word divorce kept echoing in my head. Understood.
Heh, that's a done deal then.
Before I knew it, I had given my consent. Why hadn't I thought of divorce before? Internally, I even felt a sense of relief. A broken relationship isn't easily mended, and a distorted personality never returns to its original form. I'll get in touch about what comes next. A transfer and a divorce. There's a mountain of things to do. From then on, every day was a battle. Preparing for the transfer, handing over duties, preparing for the divorce, and creating various documents. It was a level of business I hadn't experienced since my 30s. However, every task eventually comes to an end. Somehow, I managed to wrap everything up and was relatively relaxed at my new branch. Ah, this matter is fine as it is, and this part. Yes, could you please make this revision? Oh, a phone call. It was a weekday afternoon. The shrill sound of my smartphone displayed Susan's name. Though it was a busy time at work, her call was expected. She probably received the documents. Hello? Did you get a chance to review the documents?
What on earth is going on here? A demand for compensation and such a huge amount of money, even if it is fraud. This is awful.
It's not fraud. It's a legitimate claim made with the help of a lawyer.
What?
Her shouting was so loud that it echoed across the floor despite being over the phone. Feeling it was a nuisance to others, I moved to a conference room.
What's legitimate about this claim? I haven't cheated. And the spending, we're married, you should be more forgiving.
I think I've been more than forgiving. Besides, I've sent you proof of the cheating. I had my suspicions, but this was truly shocking. You lied about being infertile, didn't you?
That's
20 years ago. No, it was even before we met. So maybe I'm the one being cheated on here. You already had an adult child with someone else. When we met, were you just looking for a cash cow to support that child? There was certainly anger, but deep inside, my head was chillingly cold. Oddly calm, I continued to question Susan. It was careless of me to have left the household finances to such a person. Well, it wasn't uncommon for husbands to leave the household finances to their wives.
what are you trying to say?
You've been withdrawing our money on your own to support your lover and your child. Those frequent trips and meals out, you went with them. Susan gritted her teeth. I could even hear the grinding of her teeth over the phone. But she wasn't the type to admit everything here.
So what? We're married. Your money is my money. I can use it however I want.
You have a refreshingly self-centered way of thinking. At this point, your arguments don't matter. Factually, your actions are seen as mismanagement of shared assets from a third-party perspective.
Ugh. But that has nothing to do with the division of property. No matter what, the division of marital assets is 50-50. Even with the amount you're claiming, my share is too little.
She kept expressing dissatisfaction, one complaint after another. However, there's no place for such flawed logic in the adult world. Unfortunately, that's your half of the shared assets. I'm only requesting additional alimony and compensation for mismanagement because, frankly, you've been funding your affair with my earnings.
No way. If I'm saddled with this much debt, how am I supposed to live from here on out? And if the division of property is this meager, what are you going to live on?
What about it? I'm still working. Plus, I still have the savings from before I was married. I'll manage. Searching for her next words, Susan repeated meaningless phrases like, that, and. When I tried to hang up the phone since I had nothing else to say, she raised her voice to stop me.
Wait, if you have that much money to spare, you should help me out, whether it's alimony or child support. There are plenty of ways to pay money, right? I can't live like this.
I don't know. Once we're divorced, you're just a stranger. I have no obligation or reason to pay alimony or child support, and you should be turning to someone else, not me.
But
Just having someone in mind is enough for me. Now, I need to get back to work. You may not understand since you haven't worked in a while, but it's a weekday afternoon. This is utterly unreasonable. There was no point in listening any further. With that thought, I forcibly ended the call and turned off the phone. I could hear Susan's voice trying to stop me until the very end, but there was no point in listening to her words. I would have liked to delete her contact then and there, but that would have to wait a bit longer. As I left the conference room, I felt exhausted that the issues I thought had been resolved were still lingering. Some time had passed since my call with Susan. Finally, I had ended our relationship. Of course, it wasn't smooth, but with professional help, I managed somehow. Susan complained bitterly until the very end, but I had no obligation to deal directly with her anymore. Concerned about her reliability in making installment payments, I demanded a lump sum payment. Of course, that included compensation for her affair. Apparently, both she and her affair partner were in quite a mess because of the debt incurred. However, that was beyond my concern. I confirmed the deposit, blocked Susan's number, and later deleted it. One day 3 years later, I had become 62. I was staying in a luxury hotel during a business trip. As one ages, opportunities to enjoy fine dining come by often enough, but a good meal still excites the heart. After finishing a day's work and to rejuvenate for the next day, I was dining in the hotel restaurant and had just taken a sip of wine when someone unexpectedly addressed me.
Is that you?
Susan. I didn't want to hear her voice, but it had been so long that I inadvertently turned around. There stood Susan, unchanged from those days. It seemed she too had spoken out simply because she was startled to see me, and then she covered her mouth awkwardly.
No, wait. You've mistaken me for someone else. Sorry.
She quickly tried to leave, but the man standing next to her stopped her.
Susan, is this your ex-husband?
Tom.
The man, who was all smiles and could only be described as fresh-faced. He introduced himself as Tom Mazer, apparently Susan's new husband. He was 2 years younger than Susan, about 50 this year, but looked remarkably youthful.
I've heard a lot about you. I understand you were quite the elite.
Thanks. He insisted on a handshake, and I reluctantly agreed. It appeared he was a salesman, soon to be promoted to branch manager. He exudes confidence even in his posture, clearly a man who has thrived in the public eye. That made me wonder, why would someone like him marry Susan?
However, I cannot forgive what you did to Susan.
What?
But meeting here must be some kind of fate. I have no intention of forgiving you, but perhaps as men who once loved the same woman, we could have a talk?
Wait a minute. You can't just decide that.
Black and white, front and back. He seemed to be someone who wanted to make clear distinctions between extremes. Yet, his words caught my attention. What exactly are you implying I did to her?
Are you playing dumb?
His smile, which had been warm and engaging, now clouded over. Meanwhile, Susan, seemingly protected by him, also showed signs of agitation.
Tom, let's just go, okay? I'm getting hungry.
Okay, Susan, you go ahead. I need to sort this out with him a bit longer.
Tom, come on.
Susan was desperately pulling on Tom's arm, trying to leave the scene. However, Tom seemed quite stubborn, and while still smiling gently, he made no move to leave.
You cheated, right? And not just that, you heartlessly abandoned her after she incurred debts for her sick parents. Is that something a human does?
sick parents. Susan, did you have such people in your life?
Yes.
Susan, defiantly insisting on her point, was clearly avoiding eye contact. It was obvious she was lying. I sighed and said to Tom, "I see how it is. I understand what you're trying to say, but how about you listen to my side? There are discrepancies in what you've heard from her."
What?
Come on.
Susan's habit of interrupting others hadn't changed. Despite my reluctance, I had gotten used to it and continued. One reason for our divorce was infidelity. Not mine, but Susan's. She had been involved with another man before meeting me and even had a child with him.
What? She told me she was infertile.
I was told the same, but in reality, she had a child. Moreover, Susan used my money to support that man and their child. I explained to Tom, one by one, the facts I had uncovered 3 years ago. During this, he looked at me with a probing gaze. That's why I divorced her, and I demanded compensation and alimony for the money she had misused. That's the real nature of Susan's debt.
That's not true. He's just making things up. You don't need to listen to him.
By the way, here's the evidence. Lucky timing. I had forgotten to pack it with other documents during my move. While saying this, I pulled an envelope from my bag. Inside were the proofs of Susan's infidelity I had gathered 3 years ago.
This is...
Whether you believe it or not is up to you, but this is all the truth I can offer.
This is nonsense. It's too convenient that you just happen to carry such evidence around.
That's why I said it was lucky timing. I'm heading back to the headquarters now. Susan was taken aback by my words. That made sense. 3 years ago, she barely listened to what I had to say, causing a fuss about my supposed demotion and divorcing me.
Headquarters? Ha, you were demoted. There's no coming back at your age.
Not really. I'm actually going to take over as president at the headquarters. The move to the countryside was always under that premise. You just assumed it was a demotion.
What are you saying? So you deceived me.
It seemed she hadn't anticipated that. Susan, revealing her true colors, lashed out at me.
You did all this just because you wanted a divorce? That's really low.
Who's the low one? You didn't listen when I tried to tell you. Plus, you were the one who caused the divorce.
But you deceived me into getting a divorce. I'll claim damages for emotional distress. Give back the money you took from me.
Time passes, but people's fundamentals don't change. I realized that deeply. Looking at Tom, it seemed he had something to think about.
Indeed, it seems worth considering. James, thank you for sharing this valuable information. It appears I have some things to verify with her.
Yes, I hope it turns out well for you.
Hey, I'm not done talking to him yet.
Let's go. We need to talk.
Tom nodded politely and then left the restaurant without having his meal. Susan was dragged away, resisting vigorously, but ultimately her strength was no match for Tom's. She couldn't overcome his force and was taken along.
Remember this.
I sighed at her parting words and took a sip of the remaining wine. It had grown warm and lost its original flavor. The next morning, as I was about to leave the hotel, Susan ambushed me from a blind spot.
I've got you. How are you going to take responsibility for this?
What are you springing out at me for? I haven't done anything to you. Take your grudges somewhere else.
This isn't about holding grudges. It's your fault I'm covered in debts from 3 years ago, and now because of you, I have to divorce. Tom is even talking about claiming alimony. I'm going to end up broke again.
That's not my fault. Susan, yelling, blocked my way out of the hotel. However, her arguments were as disjointed as ever, and I could only respond with a sigh. Frustrated by my response, Susan raised her voice even more.
Just compensate me. I'm going to claim damages for all the misery you've caused me. You need to feel the weight of the emotional pain you've inflicted.
It seems you can only see things from your perspective. There's no way such irrational demands will hold up. Your claims are absurd. My admonishing words only increased Susan's irritation, and she lunged at me, grabbing me by the collar and shaking me. As she did, I could feel my neck tightening.
That condescending attitude of yours, I've hated it for a long time.
I don't care about that. You should have said so when we were married.
Shut up. Don't just respond with logical arguments.
Susan then raised her fist to strike, and I instinctively closed my eyes. Although her strength was limited, a full-force blow could still leave a bruise. Like an escape from reality, I was anxious about the work that lay ahead.
When I thought you were gone, what on earth are you doing here?
Tom.
However, Susan's punch never reached me. Just in time, Tom intervened.
I'm sorry, James. It was my fault for not keeping an eye on her.
No, you've helped me out. I heard you're getting a divorce too? Sorry to involve you in this mess.
No, we are still married for now.
Tom firmly held Susan. His body remained steady, effectively restraining her movements. I was impressed by his control, and he responded with a small smile.
Actually, I've kept myself quite fit. Stopping Susan is no trouble, so rest assured.
That's impressive.
What are you acting like it's all over for? I'm not done talking. You guys better stop underestimating me.
Even restrained, Susan tried to fight back with her nails and heels, more like a beast than a woman. Her hair disheveled, she continued without caring about the attention she was attracting.
I'll sue both of you. You'll see how scary a woman can be. Don't think you've won just because you can hold me down.
You still have that much energy. Just do whatever you want. You hardly have a chance of winning anyway.
That's true. Why don't you give up already? You shouldn't waste money on such nonsense. You still have our divorce settlement to think about.
Shut up.
At that moment, the clock at the front desk chimed. It was already 8 o'clock. Since it was a weekday and I hadn't taken a day off, I needed to head to the office soon.
James, are you okay with the time?
He must have noticed me checking my watch. Tom asked me as he noticed this. Despite the previous day's unpleasant encounter, it seems Tom, being a salesman, is quite perceptive of others. I could sense his competence as I responded. Sorry, but I've reached my limit. Can I leave Susan in your care?
Yes, as I mentioned earlier, Susan and I are still married. Oh, but please take this.
A phone number?
It's my private number. You might need it later on.
I accepted the number with a wry smile. The thought of dealing with Susan again was exasperating, but I knew that leaving things unresolved might lead her to persistently haunt me. That's right.
You're running away.
I'm not running away. I'm going to work. Susan raised her voice in a last-ditch effort. But I had no more time to spare for her, so I dismissed her coldly.
Always acting so superior with your work, work, work.
Who was it that told me not to slack off and keep working when I came home on time during our marriage? And I told you 3 years ago, you might not understand since you don't work, but today is a weekday.
You.
Wait, you need to have a discussion with me.
Leaving Susan and Tom behind, I exited the hotel. I hoped their discussion would lead to a good outcome. Later on, I learned that Susan and Tom had successfully divorced. Susan had apparently treated Tom much like she did to me. Furthermore, she had ended up paying off the debt she accrued from our divorce, combined with what she owed her lover, a substantial sum. I heard later that she had been charged heavily for alimony and compensation. And who did I hear this from?
James, listen to this.
Tom, aren't you drinking a bit too much? For some reason, Tom had become quite attached to me. Despite the initial friction, I maintained a polite distance, but his personality was too compelling. Eventually, he managed to persuade me, claiming I was his benefactor, and it became impossible to dismiss him rudely. Before I knew it, Tom and I were frequently out drinking together.
By the way, Susan has gone missing, hasn't she?
Yes, you mentioned that.
Actually, before that, it seems she had a huge fight with her lover.
What? Tom's story went like this. Apparently, after the incident at the hotel, Susan, who was set to divorce Tom, had a huge fight with her lover. The lover was furious after being demanded alimony not once, but twice. However, Susan wasn't the type to quietly accept such unfairness. They ended up in a shouting match, which escalated into a physical fight. Their loud nighttime argument, conducted without regard for the neighbors, was quickly reported to the police, and for amusement, someone uploaded a video of it to social media. Unfortunately, the video quickly went viral.
It turned out that neither Susan nor her lover could stay in the same place anymore, so they both disappeared. They're probably still living somewhere in hiding.
Considering how Susan used to dress flamboyantly to attract attention, it's ironic she now lives discreetly to avoid it. The thought made me laugh, especially with the help of the alcohol. It seems they ended up exactly where they belonged.
That's true.
As the alcohol took effect, such talk made a good accompaniment to our drinks. Tom and I ended up enjoying a longer night than usual. After the incident with Susan, I became president as expected. My responsibilities and duties increased, but my days are incredibly fulfilling. I'm completely done with romantic entanglements, but I genuinely enjoy my work. In about 3 years, I'll be 65 years old. However, both the company's request and my own desire have led me to plan to stay in this position until I'm 70. I intend to commit myself to my work for the rest of my life.